Well, from driving safe, we talk about crude oil exploration in Ghana and how far we have come. It's all a talk about the PIAC Semi-annual report. And the latest findings in that semi-annual report shows that irregularities are extant in the oil and gas sector. Following the acquisition of 7% interest in the Jubilee and 10 fields by the GNPC in 2021, which was later ceded to its subsidiary, that is JOL or the JOHL, it made its first lifting of 944,164 barrels on the Jubilee field in H1 2022, amounting to over 100 million American dollars. This amount was not paid into the Petroleum Holding Fund. Contrary to Section 6E of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, that is the PRMA 2011 Act 815. Capital gains tax was not assessed and collected by the Ghana Revenue Authority in the sale of the 7% interest by Anadako in the Jubilee and 10 fields in 2021. Today we probe this matter with Nasir Alpha Mohammed. He is a vice chairperson of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee and also representative of the Ghana Bar Association on that committee. Nasir, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, and good morning to our viewers and listeners out there.
It's a pleasure having you. I just want us to start the conversation from the standpoint of this semi-annual report. Give us details of how often this happens and why even we have to do this.
I just want to be clear in my mind how often
so the semi-annual
report.
How often we have this report and why do we even go to it on the back of our petroleum revenue? I just want you to expand on that for ordinary people.
That's fine. Under the law, which is the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, we are required under Section 56 to report to the elected representatives of the people of Ghana, to His Excellency the President of Ghana, and generally to the people of Ghana. And we are required to produce 2 statutory reports in a year. The first is the semi-annual report, which is supposed to be published by the 15th of September each year, and then the annual report, which is supposed to be published around March the following year, following that particular year you are assessing. And so since 2011, when the Public Interest and Accountability Committee was established, we have been producing these statutory reports. So far, we have produced 22 statutory reports. This current one is the 11th semi-annual report, and the 22nd in total of all our statutory reports that we have made. And so, yes, this is how often we do our reports, semi-annual and annually. And we have published as many as 22 statutory reports so far.
We have that JOL situation that I was just talking about, the 7% that stands out. But before we get into that specific matter, we're talking oil production, gas production, we're talking sources of petroleum revenue, we're talking about APFA utilization and all of that. Give us a bit of a breakdown of what exactly this latest report evinces on the back of some of these topical matters. In recent times, we've heard, not just in recent times, the APFA and how it's been utilized and how sometimes it breaches the law and all of that. What, in a summary way, can you tell us about these in the latest report? You can take them apart one by one.
Well, generally, oil revenues are supposed to be disbursed in accordance with rules and regulations stipulated in the Petroleum Revenue Management Act. Now, it is not all oil revenue that goes into the annual budget funding amount. We have other funds as well. So petroleum revenue coming from all the revenue streams goes into the Petroleum Holding Fund for starters. And then
that is the PHF.
That is the PHF. Now we calculate about 51% of the carried and participating interest, which is only one of the revenue streams that comes in, and then we give it to GNPC for its expenditure and all that. Then the remaining will then be disbursed, according to the Act, to the Ghana Petroleum Funds, which includes the Ghana Stabilization Fund and then the Ghana Heritage Fund. We disburse to the Ghana Heritage Fund for purposes of intergenerational equity, so that Ghanaians, children who are yet unborn, will be able to also benefit from the oil and gas resources, given that oil is an exhaustible natural resource. And
it's finite.
It's finite. It is not for only the living generation. It is also for the future generations. And so we leave a bit of that for them. Then to the Stabilization Fund, to cushion our budgeting in times of unanticipated fiscal imbalances. We have something for Stabilization Fund. But then we have an amount that goes into the annual budget funding amount. This is the dedicated amount that is supposed to help government to fund its developmental projects and all of that. So we have these various ways of disbursing the funds in the annual budget funding amount. Now, when it comes to the annual budget funding amount itself, it's supposed to be spent in a way that is also itemized in the Act. Out of 12 priority areas, the law stipulates that the Minister for Finance, in the absence of a long-term national development plan, should choose up to 4 priority areas of that 12 priority areas and spend the money on them. Now, in the past, succeeding governments have chosen different priority areas. Some have repeated some of those priority areas and all that. Currently, between 2020 and this 2022, we are doing these 4 priority areas: agriculture, rail, and other critical infrastructure development, which is the second. We have physical infrastructure and service delivery in education and health, which is the third, and we have industrialization. So these are the 4 priority areas that the government...
What's the 4th one again?
The 4th is industrialization.
Right.
So currently, these are the 4 priority areas we are doing. And these are the areas into which the government disburses annual budget funding amount into.
We'll get into the question of whether all these disbursements are actually made, but I just want us to take a quick look at the data as we have it, looking at our crude oil production between 2010 and now, 2022. And it creates an interesting picture if we can have those visuals. That is page 17 of the executive summary, if you want to call it that. And in 2011, now this started 2010.
Yeah.
So 2011, we produced some 10,669,462 barrels. I'll not be mentioning the other, I'll just peg it at the highest.
Yeah.
So, and you see, it's been incremental ever since. In 2012, over 11 million. In 2013, over 18 million. Again, in 2014, over 18 million. In 2015, 19 million plus. 2016, there was a sharp fall of about 8 million barrels to 11,440,000. But from there, it took off again. 2017, and this, of course, was the time of the ruling administration. So that became 24 million plus. In 2018, 28 million plus. In 2019, 34 million plus. This is, when you look at the 34 million we produced in 2019 and 2020, that is over 34 million. That is over what? 3 times what we actually produced at the start in 2011. It's almost 3 times as well of what we produced in 2012. So it just tells you about how much incrementally we were producing. In 2021, there was a little dip of about what, some 7 million barrels. It fell to 27. And in 2022, we know with everything happening globally, it fell to over 25 million. Just 200,000 barrels away from 26 million. But still, it means we're in a good step. What does all of this mean in terms of reflecting in our state's kitty, in the different sectors that it should reflect?
I think it is important for us to situate this conversation well. So when you look at 2011, for example, and here we are only dealing with half years that we are comparing, comparative analysis for half year. So you realize that we started getting our petroleum revenue in 2011. So as we get petroleum revenue in 2011, that was the time we also started production. Production started in December 2010.
Exactly.
And so we didn't really produce that much.
No, we didn't.
And so we couldn't possibly have gained much from oil.
So, of course, the recording year starts from 2011.
Yes, and besides, we had only the Jubilee field So from 2011, 2012, 2013, and some part of 2014, it was just the Jubilee field that we had.
Yeah.
So even though there was incremental, production,
more fuels came on board.
Yes, more fuels came on board from 2014 onwards. So when the 10 came on board, and then 2016, 2017, when the SGN came on board. So definitely, that was how the incremental volumes that occur, because we now have more fields. So cumulatively, we're producing more. But you realize that in 2016, there was a little drop, and that is explained by operational losses resulting from the turret bearing remediation of the FPSO, and other associated operational losses. But then we took, production started rising again in 2017, 2018, thereabout, because we did not have some of these operational losses again. And we did well until 2021. So starting from 2020 and down to 2021, you would realize because of COVID-19 and also because of the recent Ukraine and Russian war, we did not have a lot of investments going into the oil and gas industry as such. And so we had a dip again around that time. So, yeah.
Tell me, the three fields we've been operating, SGN, 10, Jubilee, how productive have they been? People have spoken about their levels of productivity, what we're getting from them in terms of real value, and of course, what is leaving our shores on the back of this exploration. Have we met the standards in terms of what we should be getting as a people from these three oil fields?
In terms of revenues?
In terms of revenue.
Well, in terms of revenue, if we're talking about revenue, we have to take it from the point of view of the contracts we negotiated with them, right?
And the royalties
you get
we
what
expected.
we negotiated for,
right.
The royalties. So you realize that in all instances, all the fields that we are currently getting production from now, these were fields, the petroleum agreements of which were negotiated earlier in time, at a time when the petroleum basins of Ghana were relatively risky. And so we needed investment from the international investment, from the international investors to come into Ghana to be able to invest in the oil and gas industry. And if we know, the oil and gas industry is capital intensive in nature. And so when they come, they tend to negotiate for opportunities like tax concessions, and all of that to make up for the investment losses they may have in case they hit dry oils. And so in the early stages, we actually gave a lot of fiscal concessions to these oil companies. And the petroleum agreements are always long-term in nature, 25 years, 30 years, and all of that. And so once they get this, in addition to the stabilization clause that they negotiate for, and in those days it was freezing stabilization clauses, and even though some of them were blended with economic equilibrium clauses, the freezing stabilization clauses almost always is what the international oil companies would hold on to. And so even though you may have changed your laws in the future to ensure that Ghana gets more revenues, the international oil companies would not agree to that, because they will tell you that it will make the economic bargain they negotiated with you be imbalanced. And to that extent, they won't go for that. So yes, for me, it's a function of our negotiation from the very beginning. That is why we are not getting much at the moment.
I know what goes into contracts and how you can't just, pick and choose or tweak such international contracts, especially when they're dealing with MNCs, multinational corporations, but especially when it's not inuring to the benefit of the people. And it's been said time and again, even by the likes of Dr. Steve Mantea, who has been where you are, among others, that we're only getting a pittance for, these raw materials, these natural boons that we have. And like you mentioned, they are not finite. Why are we still sticking to the 7% and the 10% and all of that?
Yeah, so for me, I agree with all of those persons who argue that way, including my very respected Dr. Mantea, that we are receiving a pittance. But I was only giving a background as to why we are receiving a pittance at the moment. because all the petroleum agreements that we are currently benefiting from in terms of the fields, these are agreements that were negotiated earlier in time. And we did not make room for proper renegotiation when in the future we realize that we are not getting much. So we have put a stabilization clause there, a freezing stabilization clause, which entitles the Jubilee partners, the 10 partners, the SGN partners, to insist on the economic bargain they had with us from the very beginning and not to depart from that economic bargain. And so technically, it is difficult for us to be able to get more than we are currently getting, except that from 2013, 2014 going, from 2015 onwards, we have started seeing some changes where Ghana no longer puts just freezing stabilization clauses, but only insists on economic equilibrium clauses. And these economic equilibrium clauses gives us an opportunity to call for renegotiation of the petroleum contracts when we realize that the bargain is not in favor of Ghana. And that is a good thing that we have started doing, right? But I just want to emphasize that, yes, we could have negotiated for better, even in those days when we didn't, when our petroleum basins were still risky. We could have negotiated for better because comparatively, other jurisdictions, people are able to do so. Yeah.
Is that to say you will advocate for better?
Of course, we are advocating
given the opportunity.
Yeah, we are advocating for better, and I'm just suggesting that as it stands now, we are beginning to negotiate somehow for better. At least we no longer subscribe to the freezing stabilization clauses. We now subscribe to economic equilibrium clauses, which gives Ghana
What's the difference?
itself. The difference, as I indicated, that for the freezing stabilization clauses, Ghana is, excluding the government itself and all the agencies of government from applying new laws to these Jubilee partners, 10 partners, SGN partners, that will change the economic bargain they had with us from the very beginning when they negotiated with us. That is a freezing stabilization clause. Now, an economic equilibrium clause would have given us the opportunity to call for renegotiation where we realize that they are, for example, getting windfall.
Exactly.
And when we are not benefiting much, we can call them to the table and say, now, you are getting more than we originally
far in excess of what was planned.
And therefore, let us renegotiate in such a way that we can have the equities balanced. But let Ghana also earn something. So for me, I think that is one of the root causes why we don't really get much. But beyond that one, there are still other issues. Now, we give them an opportunity to recover their costs. And so they use that opportunity to bring in all sort of costs involved and all of that, when some of those costs are actually not those that go to the route where they could recover. So that brings the issue of cost monitoring. To what extent are our authorities doing the cost monitoring properly, so-called? What costs are they entitled to recover, and what are they not entitled to recover? If we were doing our cost monitoring very well, some industry analysts have argued that we could have saved some revenues from that angle if we were monitoring the cost.
So clearly we're not doing it well enough.
Of course, that is what it means. I mean, if you look at the research data that is available, PIAC commissioned an assessment of our petroleum revenue management for 10 years from 2011 to 2020, and this is one of the findings that came up.
So it also means that when you look at what we've accrued so far, that is 2011 to 2022, the 8.09 billion, it means that, and of course, in this year, 2022 alone, in terms of royalties, we've got something around 731 plus million, almost 732 million American dollars. It means that we could have got maybe far in excess of this in terms of real value from the exploration of our oil.
Of course, if we negotiated very well, yes. If we negotiated very well. That's true.
When I look at part of the report, it talks about the GHF and the GSF with about 849.91 million that's American dollars for the GHF, and 373 plus million for the GSF, being balances of the Ghana Petroleum funds as at the end of H1 2022. What does all of this mean?
Well, as I indicated to you, ideally we are supposed to be leaving some portion of our oil revenue for generations yet unborn, and that is for intergenerational equity purposes, and that's the Ghana Heritage Fund. It is that amount that is in excess of 800 million Ghana cedis, because since 2011 we've not been touching that amount at all, even though some have argued that in all our economic problems, why keep this quantum of money and then be having problems? But we have advocated strongly, PIAC and other civil society organizations, that this is not money we have to touch at all, because that money constitutes only about 9% of our total oil revenues. So the 91% of our total oil revenues, are actually pumped into our economy, including the 51% of carried and participating interest that we give to GNPC, including the annual budget funding amount that we give to government for purposes of the budget, and then the Ghana Stabilization Fund, which, as I said, is there to help government cushion its budgetary requirements in times of unanticipated fiscal imbalances. So it tells you that apart from this Ghana Heritage Fund, which is just a mere 9% of the total oil revenues that we are keeping for our generations yet unborn, 91% of that is being invested in our economy. And so if over 91% of oil revenue is being invested in our economy, and we are still not happy, what can the 9%, that small 9%, do for us if we were to bring it on board? So for us, we think that to the extent that, as I indicated, this is an exhaustible natural resource, and the fact that natural resources worldwide, that is the principle, are not only for the living, but also for generations yet unborn.
For the yet unborn,
it is important for us to leave something behind for them to be able to take.
And it's stark when you paint that picture of what we're investing even in our economy and how little, it's like a drop in a bucket, just a trickle. And we still want to pump in more. When, forgetting about those that are yet unborn. And like we keep mentioning, our gold, our oil, all of these are very finite resources. If we don't leave something for them, only God knows what they would have to come and take.
In fact, even why even focus on oil revenues alone? Because oil revenue on the average constitutes only about 7%.
Fraction.
Right? Only about 7% of the total government revenues for each year. So if you take it from 2011 up till now and you do the mathematics, there are times we have only 3% of total oil revenue. Right. There are times we have 4%, 6%, 12%. But when you do the average, it comes to around 7%. So that tells you that on the average, we are doing only about 7% of oil revenue, 7% of total government revenue coming from, oil. So why even the focus on oil revenue alone when it comes to resources we need to ensure that our developmental agenda is prosecuted?
All right. Let's get into that bit about, maybe I'll skip the distribution of the AFA. I want us to talk about the petroleum production and sales. And with a focus, I just want, maybe if we could put page 17 on. I just want people to realize or pay attention to what, like Nasir mentioned, we should be focusing on, at least what we've committed to focus on. Agriculture, road, rail, and other critical infrastructure development, that's on page 17. Physical infrastructure and service delivery in education and health. And finally, industrialization. When we look at these core areas, are we getting things right? But let's bring in the petroleum production and sales. I want us to hammer on that before we wrap the conversation. So per what you've garnered from your research, following the acquisition of 7% interest in the Jubilee and 10 fields by the GNPC, we know that JOL took over, made its first lifting of over 944,000 barrels on the Jubilee field in H1 2022, amounting to over $100 million. This amount was not paid into the Petroleum Holding Fund. What happened?
Well, our duty, our mandate as a public oversight body is to ensure that every dollar of oil revenues actually goes into the Petroleum Holding Fund. That is the mandate of PIAC. So for us, when we are doing our analysis, we take into consideration our ultimate responsibility to the people of this country, which is to ensure that every petrodollar goes into the Petroleum Holding Fund. Now, GNPC is the commercial representative of Ghana when it comes to our upstream petroleum exploration, development, and production. Now, JOHL is 100% subsidiary of GNPC. And how did JOHL even come into the picture when, in fact, it is GNPC that is supposed to be our commercial representative? Now, Anadaco was, a partner on the Jubilee and 10 fields, and Anadaco wanted to exit the Republic of Ghana.
Of course, there must be a plan.
Sell its equity interests to those who are interested in it. As a nation, we declared our interest for 7% joint, to jointly acquire from the Jubilee and 10 fields, right? Now, one would have expected GNPC itself to have taken on that 7% that we wanted to buy.
Why do you think they didn't? Just a quick aside.
Well, GNPC has, they have established GNPC Explorer, which is like a commercial entity they have established to help them explore for oil. And they have been doing that. So some of the blocks, we actually have Explorer as being a partner in some of the blocks. So the expectation was that if GNPC itself will not take on those 7 interests, at least its 100% subsidiary, which is GNPC Explorer, could have taken up that 7%, right? But GNPC claims that this is a purely commercial transaction that we do not need to drag the Ghana as a sovereign state bit into, because Anadaco itself, objected to that kind of arrangement and wanted it to be a purely commercial transaction.
On hindsight, was that a very good decision?
For us, it is not a very good decision. And even if it was, we are so much interested as a public oversight body on what the revenues that accrue from that transaction, would be treated. How are we going to be treating that kind of revenue? The Petroleum Revenue Management Act, if you look at sections 3, section 6E, and section 7, cumulatively, when you do a combined reading of these sections, you will come to the conclusion that the Act requires that wherever Ghana participates upstream for petroleum production, for petroleum production, properly so-called, then whether directly or indirectly, it doesn't matter whether Ghana's participation is directly or indirectly. And as I told you, GNPC is the commercial representative of Ghana. So if JOHL is a subsidiary, 100% subsidiary of GNPC, it should mean that JOHL, whatever interest it is holding there, it is holding it in trust for Ghana, right? So, so our argument is that whichever way you look at it, whether JOHL is seen to be a direct participation or indirect participation of GNPC, whatever comes out of a lifting done by JOHL, should the returns that we get from any lifting by JOHL should first be deposited in the Petroleum Holding Fund, and then subsequent disbursements can be made.
Quick questions. So, following the paper trail, you've spoken about how this contravenes Section 6E of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, that is the PRMA. And here it is clear that capital gains tax was not assessed and collected by the Ghana Revenue Authority. And that's interesting because the 7% interest was to come from Anadaco in the Jubilee and 10 fields in 2021. It wasn't assessed by the GRA. And of course, we can take out the GNPC at this point. But where did this end up then? Shoring up our economy? I mean, how do we account for this?
Yeah, because at the moment, the transaction is complete, right? GNPC, through its subsidiary JOHL, is in business. So that is why PIAC, we actually raised this matter. First of all, it comes from the root cause. Because GNPC is proceeding under the misapprehension that...
Under the misapprehension?
Yes.
Or misunderstanding?
Misunderstanding, let me put it that way. That transaction, JOHL transaction, is purely commercial, and that the proceeds of liftings from that transaction does not constitute petroleum revenue. and therefore could not be deposited in the Petroleum Holding Fund. Now, we hold a contrary opinion.
Right.
And we say that whichever way you look at it, whether commercial transaction or non-commercial transaction or whatever, the law requires that where the Republic of Ghana participates directly or indirectly in a petroleum activity upstream and revenue is accrued out of that, that revenue ought to be deposited in the Petroleum Holding Fund for subsequent disbursement. Now, our reading is that JOHL, it's not just a company standing in the abstract. JOHL is 100% subsidiary of GNPC, which is supposed to be the commercial representative of the people of this country when it comes to upstream petroleum activities.
Right.
So for us, it is either direct or indirect. For some of us, we even think this is a direct participation. But even if you think that it is an indirect participation, the law still says that deposit the returns on that lifting into the Petroleum Holding Fund for subsequent disbursement. In any case, the acquisition of the 7% was done with monies advanced by the Ministry for Finance, right? Even though GNPC is repaying that particular loan. What we advocate is that if the returns on the JOHL transaction had been deposited in the PHL, now we could calculate the 51% of the capital, the carried and participating interest that GNPC, that is due GNPC to them, and then all the other funds can have their due. So Ghana Stabilization Fund would have had its due from that amount. The Ghana Heritage Fund would have had its due from that amount. And, in that respect, the annual budget funding amount would have had its due from that amount.
And
so by not depositing it there, you have actually prevented, or you have actually starved these other funds from legitimate revenues that should have gone.
Of getting their due, the cut of the cake.
Of course.
Which per the law, they should be getting.
Yes.
And when you turn to page 25, for example, management and performance of the Ghana Petroleum Funds, it is made clear here, the retention of the current cap of 100 million on the GSF for the year 2022 is not in accordance with the formula stipulated in LI 2381. A proper application of the formula would have returned a figure of, guess what? A whopping $460,633,074.
Yes. So you see, here, the law permits the Minister for Finance to be able to cap the Stabilization Fund and then cream off the excess revenue to help in our budgeting purposes. I mean, if the minister thinks that we really need, that. But in order not to give the minister an unregulated restriction, the LI, which is the legislative...
So that it's not just a carte blanche, do whatever you like.
Exactly. So the legislative instrument gave a formula how the minister should be able to do that. And it says that the cap should not be less than the average of the annual budget funding amount for 3 years. The year immediately preceding the current year, and then the year immediately after the current year, as you may have projected.
So before, in, and after.
Exactly. So at PIAC, when we did the calculations of these, when we applied the formula properly so-called, it returned an amount in excess of 400 million United States dollars. Meanwhile, the cap had been retained at 100 million United States dollars by the minister for 2022. And that also happened.
That's a differential of over 300 million.
Of course. And so we have a concern. We raised the same matter in our 2021 annual report because the same thing happened. And we raised it in our 2021 annual report. It is continuing in 2022. And we think that we have to raise it again in the semi-annual report. And if it continues, we may have to raise it at the end.
So it clearly means that there is a lack of compliance from the finance ministry.
Of course. That is, I mean, from our angle, that is what it is, unless they can give us a better explanation why the formula was not applied.
Just talking of the formula, we have just about a minute to wrap the conversation. I want you to do this for us. So when we go to page 27, there's more interesting conversation when it comes to the APFA and its utilization. So there was an utilized APFA of over 201 million Ghana cedis as at the end of 2021, representing 9.80% of 2021 utilization. This figure was not brought forward in H1 2022, according to the Ministry of Finance. Details of this amount will be forwarded to PIAC before the annual report. Then, no transfer of APFA was made into the District Assembly's Common Fund during H1 2022, though an amount of 157.77 million was budgeted for in 2022. My question then, how do we remedy this? How do we stem the tide of this if the Finance Ministry is simply not willing to act? What do we do?
I don't want to just say they are not willing to act.
But is it not clear, the trajectory over time? It's been brought up. I mean, it doesn't take you coming into the studio. We've had conversations in the past on this self-same matters. Nothing is happening.
Yeah, I understand. But I say so because of where I sit, with privileged information and all of that. That's why I say I just don't want to say they don't want to do it. All I can say is that the powers that be or the law should be made to work by whoever is supposed to enforce it. But because they have also explained that they have some challenges.
Right.
But we at PIAC would say that despite your challenges, you have failed to do what you are supposed to do.
Right.
However, it is not in the, it is not for PIAC to determine exactly what should happen to them. That's what I mean, because we don't have the enforcement.
I get
we don't have the enforcement power and all of that. Otherwise, they have failed to do what is supposed to be done. Now, in the area of the DACF, disbursement to the DACF, they have budgeted for it, all right. The explanation is that always, disbursement is always 1 quarter in arrears. And that has been the general principle that they've been using all over when they are doing disbursement, whether DACF or other disbursements and all of that. So we have argued that, I mean, even if...
We have less than 30 seconds.
Yes, even if the disbursements made to the DACF or the disbursement you didn't make to the DACF, even if you had made just 1 quarter, first quarter disbursement had been made, then we will buy into this explanation that it is always 1 quarter in arrears. But that's not the case. We have 2 quarters in arrears already for 2022, first and second quarter. And so we disagree with them on that.
Well, we can only wish you the very best and keep bringing up these matters, and we in the media will definitely take them up. So we can expect one more report
yes,
this year,
by
right?
March next year.
By March.
Yeah, but that will be the 2022 annual full year report.
Full year report. Thank you so much, Nasir, for joining the conversation. Nasir Alpha Mohammed is Vice Chairperson of the PIAC. He also is the representative of the Ghana Bar Association on that committee, holding leadership accountable in all spheres of our economic life. Well, this has been the conversation we've had. Up next, many more conversations we're going to be delving into. There's NSMQ, and there is that discussion as well on defense. We'll also talk about cooking the right way. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.